They say empaths can feel everything, but no one tells you what happens when they encounter the one type they can't read, influence, or emotionally decode. The INFJ, the empath of empaths. The quiet storm wrapped in intuition so sharp it cuts through emotional noise like a blade. Empaths think they're the ones absorbing energy, but an INFJ? They see energy. They analyze it. They map it. And when someone crosses their emotional threshold, no matter how sensitive or well-intentioned that person is, the INFJ becomes dangerous in the most unexpected way, through clarity, not chaos. Through silence, not reaction. Through boundaries so precise they feel like a mirror reflecting someone's truth back at them. Most people assume INFJs are fragile because they're gentle. But gentleness is not weakness. It's a choice. A controlled state. And when that state shifts, when their emotional system detects inconsistency, manipulation, or even innocent emotional overreach, they don't explode. They don't argue. They simply withdraw their access, their presence, their empathy, and the entire dynamic collapses in on itself. That is the moment empaths realize the INFJ is not someone who needs protection. They are the protection. Before we continue, answer this in the comments with one word so I know who stayed to the end. Shield. And hit subscribe. You're going to want to understand every part of what makes INFJs the calmest, quietest, and most underestimated psychological force in any relationship. Empaths feel overwhelmed by INFJs because INFJs can read them more clearly than they read themselves. It begins the moment an empath steps into an INFJ's presence. Something shifts, quietly, subtly, unmistakably. The empath senses they are being understood at a depth they never prepared for, a depth they are usually the one offering to others. They are accustomed to being the emotional compass in every room, the one who feels, absorbs, and interprets what others cannot verbalize. But INFJs do not require translation. They see straight through the empath's softened smiles, their careful tone, their unspoken tension. Instead of the empath guiding the interaction, they suddenly feel seen, mapped, and decoded by someone who doesn't even try. The INFJ isn't analyzing, they're perceiving, and to the empath, that feels like being spiritually held under a microscope. That overwhelming feeling grows because the INFJ doesn't stop at surface-level patterns. They read emotional overload the empath hasn't admitted, detect fatigue hidden behind compassion, notice guilt disguised as generosity. INFJs understand the internal storms empaths try to soothe for everyone except themselves. They see the rescuer tendencies, the self-abandonment disguised as kindness, the unspoken fear of disappointing others. And unlike most people, INFJs don't feed into the empath's emotional labor. They don't demand energy, they don't pull for attention, and they don't collapse into the empath space expecting to be saved. Instead, they quietly reflect the empath's exhaustion back to them, gently, accurately, and without judgment. It is the first time the empath realizes someone else can read their emotional landscape with the same precision they use to read everyone else's. What overwhelms the empath most is the INFJ's calm certainty. They see through the empath's emotional armor without asking for access, and they do it without pressure or intrusion. The INFJ doesn't dissect, they understand. They don't chase, they observe. They don't cling, they witness. And in that witnessing, the empath confronts truths they normally avoid. How much they give, how little they receive, how tired they actually are. INFJs read them not with intensity, but with depth. Not with judgment, but with clarity. For an empath, that level of visibility is both disarming and transformative, because for once, someone sees them as clearly as they see the world. INFJs sense emotional overstepping instantly, even when it's unintentional. It begins as a faint shift, a tone too heavy, a question too probing, an energy that leans in just a little too far. Most people would miss it, But INFJs pick it up before a single word crosses the line. Their internal radar senses emotional pressure the way others sense changes in temperature. They don't wait for someone to demand too much of them. They feel the intention forming beneath the surface. An empath might think they're simply connecting deeply or sharing naturally, yet the INFJ registers the moment connection turns into intrusion. The INFJ's mind reads the subtext, the emotional velocity, the quiet hunger for access, and they withdraw internally before the boundary is crossed externally. It's not fear, it's instinct. What makes this moment powerful is how quietly the INFJ adjusts. They don't confront or correct. They simply shift their emotional presence, slightly colder, slightly quieter, slightly harder to access. Their eyes soften, but their energy recoils, signaling without words that something invisible has stepped beyond what feels safe. The other person rarely notices the exact moment, but they feel the change. The INFJ becomes harder to read, less available, more watchful. This subtle retreat protects them from emotional merging, from being pulled into responsibilities or confessions they never agreed to hold. And because INFJs carry empathy so naturally, people often assume they can offer unlimited emotional space. But the INFJ feels the difference between genuine connection and unconscious emotional extraction, and they guard themselves the second the balance shifts. The deepest truth is that INFJs don't resent emotional overstepping. They simply cannot function when their inner world is invaded without permission. Their personality type processes emotion internally, intensely, and privately. When someone, especially another empath, leans too heavily on that inner space, the INFJ senses the pressure like a hand reaching for the inside of their chest. They pull back to maintain equilibrium, not to punish. They protect their peace, not because connection scares them, but because overstepping disrupts their ability to remain grounded and authentic. And while others may interpret this boundary as distance, the INFJ knows it is survival ensuring they remain whole enough to feel deeply without being consumed. INFJs create boundaries that feel invisible but unbreakable. People rarely notice the moment an INFJ builds a boundary because it never arrives as a wall, a warning, or a dramatic withdrawal. It emerges like air pressure changing in a room, subtle, quiet, undeniable. One day, the emotional door was open, inviting, warm. The next, there is a new stillness that cannot be crossed. INFJs don't announce their limits. They let the energy shift do the speaking. Their boundaries form internally first, a realization, a pattern recognized, a feeling of emotional imbalance. And once that truth becomes clear, the INFJ adjusts their access accordingly. They may still speak with warmth, still offer empathy, still appear open, but the deeper layers are sealed. No pleading, persuasion, or emotional intensity can penetrate that shift once it's in place. This unbreakable quality comes from the INFJ's ability to detach emotionally without creating conflict. They don't raise their voice or defend their space with arguments. They simply stop giving what was once freely offered. Their attention becomes selective. Their emotional presence becomes measured. Their intuition becomes watchful instead of welcoming. And this is why people feel the boundary without ever hearing it spoken. The INFJ's energy no longer extends outward. Those accustomed to emotional closeness feel something missing but can't identify what changed. It's like trying to grasp water that suddenly refuses to flow through your fingers. The INFJ hasn't disappeared. They've just withdrawn to a level no one can reach without earning their trust again. The power of these boundaries is that they're rooted in self-awareness rather than defense. INFJs understand exactly what drains them, what destabilizes their inner world, and what threatens their peace. Their boundary is not a punishment, it is a recalibration. They protect themselves by quietly controlling access, deciding who may approach the deeper levels and who must remain at the surface. And once that boundary forms, it is final. Not out of anger, but clarity. The INFJ's inner world is sacred ground, and they guard it with a strength most people never expect from someone so gentle. Those who try to push past it discover the truth. An INFJ's quiet boundary is more unbreakable than any spoken rule. INFJs remain emotionally stable even when empaths absorb chaos, shifting the power dynamic. An empath walks into a room and immediately feels everything: tension, sadness, excitement, unspoken pressure, often all at once. But an INFJ enters the same room and remains anchored. They register the emotional landscape without becoming part of it. This stability comes from their internal calibration. They observe emotions the way a seasoned navigator watches the sea, noting every current without letting it pull them under. While empaths often drown in the emotional storm around them, INFJs stand at the center of it with a quiet steadiness that feels almost unnatural. And this difference changes everything. People expect the most sensitive person to be the one most affected by chaos. Instead, the INFJ becomes the one least shaken by it, and that reversal shifts the entire dynamic. This calm presence subtly transforms the emotional hierarchy between INFJs and empaths. The empath, overwhelmed by energies they can't filter, instinctively seeks grounding. And that grounding is the INFJ. It's not intentional, not a performance, not an effort to control. It's simply how their inner architecture works. Their intuition categorizes emotional data instantly, sorting signal from noise, truth from reaction. They do not absorb everything. They extract only what matters. Empaths, by contrast, absorb it all, which leaves them emotionally overloaded. In the presence of chaos, the INFJ becomes the quiet center, while the empath becomes the exposed perimeter. And that quietly elevates the INFJ into a position of influence, one they never asked for but naturally inhabit. The power dynamic shifts because emotional stability is a form of authority. People trust the one who does not shake. Empaths often look to INFJs for clarity, guidance, or interpretation, not realizing they've ceded emotional leadership. The INFJ's grounded energy becomes the compass, the anchor, the rhythm everyone else adjusts to. When chaos spreads, the empath feels smaller, while the INFJ feels clearer. It is not dominance, it is resilience. And it reveals why INFJs, despite their softness, often hold the strongest psychological presence in any emotionally charged environment. INFJs detach without drama, leaving empaths confused and self-reflective. The moment an INFJ detaches is almost impossible to detect in real time. There is no argument, no emotional outburst, no cold withdrawal that announces itself. One day, the INFJ is fully present, listening, understanding, supporting, and the next, something in their energy shifts. They become quieter, lighter, almost weightless in the dynamic. An empath, who usually feels every emotional fluctuation loudly, can sense something has changed but cannot locate the exact moment it happened. That's because INFJ detachment is internal long before it appears externally. It begins as a subtle turning inward, a reclaiming of emotional territory once shared. And when they finally withdraw, it happens with the softness of a door closing on its own, leaving the empath staring at the silence, wondering what they missed. This quiet exit triggers a unique reaction in empaths: confusion first, then self-reflection. Empaths are used to feeling when someone pulls away, dramatically, emotionally, with tension they can track. But INFJ detachment doesn't follow any of those rules. It doesn't accuse, punish, or send signals. It simply happens. And because there's no conflict to read, no emotional noise to decode, the empath turns that energy inward. They start scanning themselves for answers. Did they share too much? Lean too heavily? Cross a boundary they didn't see? The INFJ's silence becomes a mirror, forcing the empath to face their own emotional habits without the distraction of external conflict. And often, for the first time, the empath realizes just how much they relied on the INFJ's presence for validation, grounding, or emotional structure. What makes this detachment so powerful is that it resets the dynamic completely. The INFJ pulls back not to punish, but to protect their peace. And because they leave without chaos, the emotional responsibility doesn't shift to them, it shifts to the empath. The empath is left with their own thoughts, their own patterns, their own questions echoing in the space where the INFJ once stood. That space becomes a quiet teacher. It reveals dependency, emotional overreach, or unbalanced expectations. And by the time the empath understands what the silence means, the INFJ is already far ahead, calm, centered, and walking toward a life that no longer drains them. INFJs mirror emotional truth so precisely that empaths confront their own patterns. There is something disarming, almost unsettling, about the way an INFJ reflects emotional reality back to an empath. Not through confrontation, not through harsh honesty, but through a quiet accuracy that feels like standing in front of a mirror that cannot be blurred or softened. When an empath speaks from emotion rather than clarity, the INFJ responds with a tone, an expression, or a silence that reveals what the empath is actually feeling, not what they intended to express. This effortless mirroring doesn't judge or criticize. It simply shows the truth with such precision that the empath can't escape their own reflection. And for someone who is used to reading others more easily than being read, this experience can feel like a revelation, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, but always honest. As this mirroring continues, something deeper happens. The empath begins to see patterns in themselves they've avoided or misunderstood. The INFJ doesn't expose these patterns through accusations. They reveal them by responding to the underlying emotional frequency rather than the surface words. If the empath speaks with avoidance, the INFJ responds with grounded presence. If the empath projects, the INFJ reflects clarity. If the empath hides behind overattachment, the INFJ's calm detachment brings that imbalance into focus. The result is a quiet internal shift where the empath starts recognizing their own emotional habits, overextending, absorbing too much, relying on others to stabilize them because the INFJ refuses to play into those dynamics unconsciously. In this way, the INFJ becomes a mirror that shows the empath not who they pretend to be, but who they really are in their emotional patterns. And while this mirroring can feel uncomfortable, it becomes a catalyst for profound growth. The INFJ doesn't use this ability to control or manipulate. They use it to maintain emotional integrity. The empath, sensing this grounded clarity, begins adjusting not out of pressure, but out of recognition. They start setting better boundaries, communicating more honestly, and confronting patterns they once ignored. The INFJ's presence becomes a quiet teacher, not demanding change, but making avoidance impossible. And in that gentle yet powerful reflection, the empath encounters something rare. A relationship where their emotional truth is not only seen, but reflected with precision. It is uncomfortable, transformative, and ultimately freeing because it reveals the path toward their own emotional clarity. INFJs protect their peace through silence, distance, and intuitive restraint. Not as a punishment, not as a dramatic exit, but as a precise emotional shift that happens the moment their internal equilibrium is threatened. Their silence isn't emptiness. It's a boundary made of air, soft enough to be overlooked, firm enough to be impossible to cross. When an INFJ senses emotional clutter, pressure, or expectations that pull them out of alignment, they don't argue or announce their limits. They simply step back into themselves. Their quiet becomes a sanctuary where their intuition can breathe, recalibrate, and decide what stays and what must be released. This kind of distance confuses people who expect confrontation or explanation because INFJ self-protection is subtle, graceful, and nearly invisible, yet absolutely final. As they create this distance, something else unfolds. Their intuitive restraint becomes the filter that determines who has access and who does not. INFJs do not cut people off impulsively. They withdraw thoughtfully, often after sensing emotional patterns long before they surface. They pull back the moment someone's energy becomes inconsistent, draining, or misaligned with their values. Their absence is not avoidance, it is discernment. In silence, they observe more clearly. In distance, they regain emotional clarity. In restraint, they choose peace over performance. And because they see the long-term impact of staying in the wrong emotional spaces, they choose the quiet exit rather than the loud confrontation. It protects their spirit, their purpose, and their inner stability. This way of protecting peace often leaves others unsettled because the INFJ's silence forces them to face their own behavior. The distance exposes who valued them and who only valued their empathy. The restraint highlights who pushed too far and who didn't understand the quiet signals. And while some misinterpret this withdrawal as coldness, the truth is much simpler. INFJs guard their inner world because it is the source of their intuition, their creativity, and their emotional depth. Without that peace, they cannot function. Their silence becomes a shield. Their distance becomes clarity. Their restraint becomes wisdom. And in choosing themselves, they choose the one thing they cannot afford to lose: their equilibrium. When an INFJ protects their peace, the world around them shifts, quietly, unmistakably, and forever. They don't return to environments that drained them, and they don't reopen doors their intuition has already closed. If you've ever watched an INFJ withdraw with calm certainty, you've witnessed a transformation, not a retreat. Their silence isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a healthier one. If this resonated with you, you already know how rare this kind of inner strength is. So tell me in the comments, one word: peace. And here's the question that reveals everything. At what moment did you realize you had to protect your energy, no matter the cost? Make sure you subscribe, because the next video will unpack the deeper INFJ emotional mechanics most people never notice until it's too late.